Welcome. Today we're going to talk about literature review and its importance in terms of measurement. We're going to talk about conceptually what measurement's all about. Literature review is one of the probably the least used ways to understand how to measure things and how to identify a project. And people say, why do I need a stupid literature review? I love the idea what this quote, I botched this guy's name. Research is to see what everybody else has seen and think what nobody else has thought. So in part, we have to know what other people have done. We have to see what other people have seen, but to think about it a little bit differently. If we didn't do a literature review, I promise what will happen is we'll end up doing a lot of good work, but we probably will have misplaced our efforts. That's to say we won't know where to focus or what's been done already. We don't want to replicate studies. What we want to do is advance science. So we could end up having some major design flaws if we don't do a literature review. Like, for example, it might be very well known not to measure something in a certain way, or there might be a standard way everybody measures something. It's very possible that if we set up an experiment a certain way, that it's likely to have significant causal problems, or we might have to control for other things. And so literature review is really, really important to try and get a well-rounded look at what's been done before and know where we might have gaps in our knowledge. Research never moves forward if it doesn't have a foundation, and that foundation is the literature. Think about what's been done before. What are we building upon? If we're building on nothing, then our studies can be washed away. And there's this potential problem of spurious correlation. That's to say that we find information that be related to each other, or variables that are related to each other, but they don't have a really solid foundation in why that might work. Somebody else might have done some causal work. Somebody else might have looked at some lab work that could move some of this work forward, or our ideas forward, and then we could apply some new case to help understand what's coming new. Literature will help you understand where your contribution fits, to know where you're situated in, maybe some famous authors or some important scientists might have said something there. It can help you understand sort of where you sit in terms of like sociology or psychology or geology or in soil science, help you kind of know what's been done. Literature review also helps spawn new questions. That is to say, as you're reading other things, you can jot down notes like, oh man, I really don't know if that's really true. I wonder if we tested it this way. But it helps you dig in deep to what you want to know about. Honestly, you don't have to reinvent the wheel for measurement or research design. That's to say, you don't have to come up with some new process. In fact, the way to move science forward, if you can think about the triangle with literature or the theory back there behind it, some new data or case over here, and then some new method. So in order to move science forward, you have to be grounded in two of these three and move one leg of the triangle at a time. That's to say, use the same theory or literature and the same method, but apply it to some new case and see what we figure out. Or maybe we use the same case, study site, study area, same theory, but we try some new method to compare. And honestly, we do this all the time when we're trying to measure vegetation cover. We have 3 or 4 different ways that we measure vegetation cover. We'll take the same plot and measure it using these 3 different approaches to see which one is maybe more accurate or gives more consistent results. You can't really move all 3 of those at once. You have to be grounded somewhere. So literature review helps you figure out what the common measurement approaches are, what the standard research designs are, so that you can advance the science. So when you do a literature review, what are you looking for? Are you looking for your exact same study? No, please no. If you find your exact same study, there is no reason to go do that again. So when you go digging for a literature review, you don't say, I want to look at exactly what you're looking at. You maybe want to look for a certain design. Are you looking at a prairie or a grassland? What other studies have been done on prairies or grasslands? And if you're looking at a specific species, you look for that sort of species and what's been done to study that. Or you might look at the theory that's going on underneath. You're looking for findings as well. As these other people have gone out and done this research, what did they learn? What did they know? How did they use their methods? What sort of relationships were they looking for between this variable and this variable? And what are these big, broad theories that are out there? If you find your exact study, you can't really redo it. What you want to do is say, well, they didn't measure this a way that I thought, or maybe they need to grab a different independent variable, or maybe there's some missing something out there, or maybe we need to apply this to a different subset of the study. But you should be looking for gaps, what things weren't answered, what things maybe do we still need to know. You're looking for holes where you can fill information. So how do you do literature review? You go to the card catalog, right? No, that's what I used to go to. Go to the Pollock library, go to the card catalog. No, you start with databases. So you can look for keywords, you look for search terms, there's a citation search. In fact, we're gonna go there right now. One of my very favorites is if you go to the Fullerton library or any of the libraries, you'll get a list of databases. And that's a pretty easy navigate. You navigate to the Fullerton library, look for databases. My favorite one's Google Scholar. And you can start looking for Google Scholar like anything. So I wrote a paper with Andy Whitford. And so we could search for Tucker Whitford technology. We search that. Okay, here's our paper, Technology and the Evolution of the Regulatory State. You can go over here and have the library find it for you. So I'm going to open that in a new tab. But I'm also going to say, well, I wonder, after, let's say we go over here and we start looking around. No, it looked like I got logged out. Let's see. Oh, here's one. So Pollock Library found it. This is where it is. I can sign in to figure out how I can download that and read it. But probably the more amazing thing, and Social Science Citation Index used to do this too, is you go here and you click on, I wonder who has cited it. So you can look at that literature, or that article, let's say Technology and the Revolution of the Regulatory State. We can look at the citations, what's been cited, who cited that. We could also dig into the article itself to see what literature that article cited. Or we could go here and say, well, who has cited this work moving it forward? So if you find an article that looks like something you want to study, you can read through that in the literature review section. You can go into their footnotes. You can see what other work they looked at. That's all going into the past. But from, let's say, Technology and Evolution of the Regulatory State was 2009. What's happened since 2009 that's built upon that work? This is what you do. You look at these citations. You say, oh, environmental regulation, intensity, manufacturing, innovation. Okay, that's 2017. Who cited that work? You could go in and you could click in here and find that this work. Like we wrote one called Focal Points in Public Policy Evidence from Voluntary Regulation in 2012. We could go find it, but then 9 people have cited that. So we can go and look at those things. So you can look backwards by looking at what's been written in those papers, backwards in time, but you can also look forward when you're moving towards, to try and catch up on the state of the science by looking at these citations. So that's a really important tool. And Social Science Citation Index, that's SSCI, and Science Citation Index used to do those same things. Google Scholar does it a little bit better now. But you can find literature review all over. I mean, you start doing a web search and you'll find all sorts of publications. Be careful that you look for things that have been peer reviewed. They've gone through a scientific process. It's not to say that news articles are bad, but news articles really provide context, but they might not give you really good information because it hasn't been vetted by other people who do that work. So let's imagine you pull up one of these articles. How do you dig in and get the most out of a literature review? Well, let me give you some suggestions. You skim it in stages. That's to say you don't read it, like pick it up and try and read the whole thing. So first, read the abstract. The abstract's right at the top. It'll tell you the whole overview and some conclusions that you need to take away from it. If that piece of literature makes sense to you, it's important to you, then the next step is to dig in. If it's not important to you, move on. Then, if that's important to you, dig into the citations. Read the titles of the papers that it cited at the very, very, very end. See if some of those papers look like they'd be interesting or maybe more applicable to you. Skim through that. If you're interested in that article still, look at the introduction and the conclusions. That's to say, the introduction sells the paper. It tells you why that study is important. The conclusion tells you what you're supposed to know from that paper. So as you read, abstract, then the citations, then the introduction and conclusion. Then, if it's still really, really important and you want to dig in even further, you go further into the methods. How did they measure something? What was their sample? Where did they do their study? And then maybe what the results are. The results should be somewhere in the methods or right afterwards. Now, as you're reading, write some things down. Write down the title and the author, the year, the journal. And then even if you're not totally interested, write down 2 sentences based on what you read in the abstract or, what you found in the intro and conclusion. At least 2 sentences. Then you don't have to go back and read it. File it away in a Word document or a Google document. File it away in a Google sheet or a Excel sheet, somewhere where you can search it. Why? Because you will remember some of these studies and you might want to pull them up later. Take some notes on some pertinent information that you might find in that study, but keep notes. But that way you don't have to go back and reread. Now, if you're trying to build a project or a paper and you're writing something, you could have this sheet out there, the Google Sheet Excel document, that you can hit Control F and find, the author or the topic, or so you can find the summary of those results. It really takes about 4 minutes or something to write these things down. And if you're going to look through these articles, spend a couple minutes just doing a really simple thing. You could probably do it in less. If you're really fast and you skim the abstract, it's not really what you want to do, but you should write it down. You can skim the abstract in about a minute, and then you could probably write down all these things in about a minute as well. So think about literature review as building your knowledge, your database for the future. Now, when you get to writing a research paper, a project, you're writing your own literature review for your project, think about it as a story. This story is like, how did I come to this outcome that I'm looking at, this dependent variable? Like, why do plants grow in this certain area? And you think about what has been said or not said about that type of plant or that type of area. And then you work through all of your independent variables kind of in a list. So your story is building. It says, why is this important? This is what the outcome that I'm looking at. These are the things that people have said that influence that outcome. Here's some competing ideas about why these things could happen. And then propose, near the end, remind people why your research question is important. You probably already wrote it at the very, very beginning, at the top of the literature review, but at the end of your literature review, before you move on to the methods or the results or the discussion, you write a little caveat at the bottom that says, this is why it's so important. We're looking at this dependent variable and it is important for us to know these things for this reason. And then you say, I'm going to tell you how I'm going to do the rest of the work. Next, I'm going to introduce the methods. And then the methods, we're going to talk about how we did the sample and why we decided to measure what we measured. Then we're going to do our analysis, and the results section is going to talk about that. And in the conclusion, we're going to offer these particular reasons. Think about your whole paper as a story. And your literature review sets the background, tells people why it's important, and then gives us a path forward on how you're going to move through your research. Now, another writing tip is how to cite in text. A lot of people will say things like, well, Johnson & Johnson suggests this. And that's just kind of clunky. Johnson & Johnson, did this research on this kind of plant or this sort of planting method, and then they said this. It would be so much easier if you took a summary of their point and then gave them credit for it. So, for example, Whitford and Tucker, this is the paper I just pulled up. Governments can create focal points around which businesses coordinate voluntary environmental standards. Parenthesis, authors and year. You could have said something clunky like, Whitford and Tucker did a study where they looked at how governments create focal points around which businesses coordinate voluntary environmental standards. Like, okay, well, it just sounds better if you say, governments can create focal points around which blah, 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 and then give them credit. Now, the better that you are at citing in text, the more fluid your story is going to flow. So be cautious about how you write. Don't make it clunky, because you want people to read your story. And most people don't skim like for the literature review, like I suggested, most people will start at the abstract, then they'll read the literature review, then they'll like progress through. When you're doing your own literature review, you want to skim so you can get the like key points. But the literature review is really a setup, and you want to hook people into reading your story.